Welcome to week 5 of the From Linear to Circular London online program. My name is Seb. You've got me for a second week in a row, you lucky people. And I'm joined today by...
Hi, I'm Rhaenyra, and I'll try not to scare anyone else. Apparently I did in my first intro this morning. I'm the Higher Education Lead at the Foundation and really excited to be co-hosting with Seb today.
There's no need to apologise, Rhaenyra, for scaring people with your enthusiasm. I hope we scare a few more people before the end of this hour. So we are going to be talking about policy. This is the week, one of the first of 2 weeks where we have some simultaneous webinars. So firstly, congratulations to everyone who's here because you made the right choice this week. I know people sometimes say to you in life that, there's no bad choices, there's any options. Well, this week you had a bad choice, plastics, you had a good choice, policy. You guys made the good choice. So congratulations. You can tell that to all your friends and colleagues when you go back into the Slack forum this week. We're going to be talking about the role of policy and policymakers at various scales in the transition to a circular economy. And what I'm 100% sure of is that, and we've got one of the Foundation's premier experts on that topic. I'm sure she won't mind me saying that, to take your questions and to take your points of view. And Rhaenyra, how do they ask those questions?
First of all, can people please mute their microphones so that everybody can get the best experience at
Zoom 101.
There we go. Excellent. So we will, as usual, be sharing everything through Slack. So always go back to the Slack platform to be able to find recordings of both this session and the simultaneous plastic ones. But just a couple of reminders around how we're going to run the session to get the most out of the webinar. Please use the chat function if you have any questions that you want to ask. We have a team of people behind the scenes ready and willing to answer your questions or to feed them through to Seb and I so that we can put them to our guest speaker today. We would remind you, please ask only content related questions. Although, if I'm still scaring you halfway through, feel free to comment on that again and I will stop. We also had some homework from last week. Last week, you were asked to watch the misconceptions video and share your reflections. So thank you so much to those of you who have done that. And we would hope throughout the series that a number of those misconceptions get picked up through either the guest speakers discussions or the questions and conversations that we have with you throughout the series.
I'm sure we will be visiting some of those misconceptions today with Ashma Sukhdev. So I'm very pleased to welcome Ashma Sukhdev, who is the lead at the MacArthur Foundation of our work with cities and government. She's worked at the foundation for, wow, over 5 years. Don't know the precise amount of time. And so she works with a number of our core partners and city partners and institutional partners, and was instrumental in the creation of the cities resources that sit on our website, Circular Economy and Cities Resources, and papers attached. So welcome, Ashma. Before I ask you a first question, Ashma, we want to try and understand a little bit more about where our audience are coming into today. And what we've realized is we don't have a polling feature. So all that stuff Rhaenyra is just telling you about the chat, let's try it out. We've got I want you to respond to 2 questions in the chat. Firstly, yes or no, do you consider yourself to be a policymaker? That's question number 1. Question number 2, do you know of any examples of circular economy programs in the cities or regions that you live in? And if so, tell us which city or region you're living in. So while we get some of those responses populating the chat, Ash, tell us a bit about how did you come to be with us today? What's your sort of story or journey to being the lead of government and cities work at the foundation in like 30 seconds to a minute, and not talking about your 500-page biography.
Damn it, I'll throw that away then. No, it's great to be here with all of you. I'm really looking forward to chatting policy, and again, very glad that you chose it over plastics. We'll also talk about plastics policy, by the way. So in terms of my background, as Seb said, I've been with the foundation for the last 5 years. I am an economist and management consultant in my past life. And I'm originally from India. I've lived in Mumbai and Singapore and London and the US. So it's been a bit of a convoluted journey to the Isle of Wight with the foundation. And in terms of sort of how I landed up at EMF, I mean, this sounds kind of geeky, but I've been obsessed with the idea of waste since I was a child. I was one of those kids that was kind of constantly recycling and convincing my college roommates not to buy bottled water. And so eventually that obsession kind of led me to people like Janine Benyus and hearing her talk about the fact that waste is a human design flaw. I think something about that sentence really gripped me. And so a few Google searches after that, you kind of land up at EMF and the idea of a circular economy. And then I found myself applying for a job here. So while my background is in economics and a bit of business, I've kind of always been interested in policy and the role that government and specifically local government can play in creating change. And so that's kind of how I've landed up specifically at this role at the moment.
Loving the different responses coming in. Quite a mixed bag actually between yeses and nos on the policymaker front. Sometimes we ask this question, you get like 99% no's. So good to see that we have some policymakers in the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it and it looks like there's a really great mix of yes and no's, but also excitingly, we've got some people from some of the cities that we work with and who are aware of their circular economy roadmaps or policies in their cities. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a great conversation. But Ash, just for the benefit of those who have said no in terms of question one there, could you talk to us a little bit about what a policymaker is and answer two questions? Exactly what is a policymaker and what is policy?
Okay. Very kind of policy is a bit hard to define, but I'm going to start with that. So I think it's essentially sort of a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in order to achieve a desired outcome. So you can have a policy on plastic bags, you can have a policy for how to tackle COVID, you can have a policy for economic development. You can have internal organizational policies as well. So they come in all shapes and sizes, roadmaps, action plans, legislation. And then policymakers are essentially the people that actually develop the policy. So whether they're working at national level with national governments or local levels with city governments, or even kind of that supranational level. So across multiple countries like the European Commission. And I think one thing to note is people often think of policymakers as the equivalent to politicians, but there's a lot of policymakers that aren't actually coming in and out with political cycles. They're sort of working with departments and are considered sort of public servants and work no matter who is in charge at the moment.
Is it fair to say that politicians perhaps sometimes have a bad name, but policy ultimately is all around us and all of us are kind of influenced by it, and some of it runs with election cycles and some of it's stuff that we might take for granted that really works in the background?
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of it does work in the background. I think definitely the stuff that is news grabbing and on TVs all the time is often to do about politicians rather than the actual policies and things they're putting in place. So yeah, I would say that.
And obviously it's fair to say this doesn't play out in the exact same way all around the world. Like when we talk about policy, it feels like context is very important, maybe in particular geographical, national context. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that policy varies significantly depending on the context and the country and region that you're in. So it's great to hear that we have such a great mixed group in this audience as well. I think the powers and the type of policy that different levels apply, again, vary depending on where you are. So typically a national government is all about setting policy direction for a country overall. And then cities and states and provinces are more about the implementations of those overarching policies. But in certain countries, city governments are more powerful than others. In certain countries, in a more sort of federal set up, like the US, state governments and state governors are quite powerful in terms of the kinds of policies and laws they can put in place. And then you have certain centralized systems like China, where the national government is sort of has a lot of the policy decisions coming from the center in that sense. So it really varies, and there's a lot of really interesting nuances in how policy is made and developed in each of those countries and contexts.
It doesn't really matter what context they are and how it differs. Essentially, policymakers are really quite crucial to this whole agenda. So can you just talk us through a little bit why policymakers are so important to accelerate the global transition to a circular economy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in very simple terms, they sort of set the rules of the game. So without policymakers, we can't necessarily transition to a circular economy. They create the sort of right enabling conditions for circular economy activities to thrive. They help set a direction. So a lot of times you might have a lot of businesses that are really excited about the circular economy, but if there's no certainty from a government that this is the direction that we want to take, that can get quite tricky. So they help set a direction and a vision. They're also, and this is sort of going back to your comment on misconceptions, Seb, they're also drivers of innovation and investment, and they can invest and innovate for a circular economy themselves. So it's not just about rules and regulations. They actually have a role to play in encouraging and driving this circular economy activity. I don't know if you all have read or heard about her, but Mariana Mazzucato is a very famous economist that gives this example of the role that governments have played in the development of the iPhone, and how without government investment, research, development, innovation, the iPhone essentially wouldn't exist, because the internet, GPS, touchscreen displays, even the technology behind Siri, all of that was funded by the US government and lots of different departments. So that technology, again, wouldn't exist without public financing. And so it's really interesting to think about the role that government can play in sort of encouraging innovation and technology as well.
I really like that example of Mariana, because what she kind of asked in that is, well, what is an iPhone? Like, if it isn't the internet, isn't your GPS, where's the actual innovation? And of course, that's not to take anything away from people who've innovated to create the product, but it does really make you think, well, what's within that, and how did that come to be? And obviously, she has quite a cool visual in her book and slide that she shares about. That kind of breaks that down piece by piece, which is great. We talked a bit about who policymakers are. We've talked a bit about what role they could play in a transition. We also have these kind of 5 levers for policy that we talk about. What that came out of our most recent research. Should I share what they are, and then maybe you can talk us through them a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of started talking at a high level about sort of the role that governments can play in a circular economy. But last year we did quite a lot of research, specifically looking at what role and what sort of policy levers urban governments can use and have at their disposal to encourage circular economy. So we came up with these kind of 5 main levers. The first is around, again, setting that direction and vision. So whether that's through a strategy or roadmap for a circular economy. The second is around engagement and developing capacity building, or gathering stakeholders together to talk about the circular economy and to learn about the circular economy. The third is around urban management, and that includes things like public procurement and urban planning and managing the assets that city governments have in their cities. The fourth lever is around economic incentives, so whether that's setting tax or any sort of fiscal systems and instruments around that encourage a circular economy. And last, but definitely not least, is the lever of regulation and legislation. So how can governments actually put into law sort of policies that actually encourage or disincentivize, encourage a circular economy and disincentivize a linear one. So those are kind of the 5 categories, which I would argue also apply largely to regional and national governments as well.
And one very quick additional thing on this kind of speaks to what you were saying earlier about the kind of maybe some of the misconceptions about policy in terms of, well, what role do policymakers play? Perhaps a lot of people think are very firmly on the regulation front at the bottom of this kind of graph, maybe a little bit towards the kind of economics incentives piece, maybe in a very narrow way. So actually it just kind of looks at a whole holistic view. And I don't know, is there a reason why vision is at the top, for example?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's partially because that's where a lot of the governments that we work with and that we've interviewed sort of start. There's always this idea of that we want to develop a circular economy roadmap or strategy, or we need to set the vision of what we're trying to achieve before actually working on specific projects or policy that kind of can create a circular economy in my city. And by setting that vision, then they can develop regulation or urban management tools or set taxes in order to achieve that vision. So it's definitely really important and sort of at the top in a way.
And we're going to come back into a bit more depth on some examples of these different aspects, but it's a good thing to share at this point. But maybe what I can ask you to do now is actually, so we've talked a bit about the different levels that we work with, and so the different, and then these are different activities that we see sitting under the umbrella. But maybe you could share a little bit more about how do we work with national governments versus cities or institutions, etc.
Yeah. So we have an institutions, governments, and cities team at the foundation, which I'm very pleased to be a part of. And I'd say that's kind of, we work with these different levels of government, but there's 2 main things that we do with them. The first is developing policy relevant insights and research to provide policymakers with the evidence base and the tools they need to understand what the circular economy is and how they can apply it in their contexts. And then we do a lot of convening as well. So we engage international institutions, national governments, and cities across our programming and activities, and connect them with the private sector and connect them with universities to really get these sort of cross and multi-stakeholder activities and projects going so that they can work on circular economy together. So that's kind of we produce content and we convene with these different levels of government.
Ash, can we just pick up a little bit on, you talked about vision as the kind of pinnacle of the image that we saw on the screen. And we're starting to see, and it's great that in the chat, we're seeing people saying, you know, my country's got circular economy in their strategy, but we are starting to see an increasing number of national and city government circular economy roadmaps or strategies, and strategies in, you know, emerging in countries like France, Finland, Colombia. And we're also seeing some of this through the plastic pack work that the foundation has been doing. So what is it? I mean, obviously visioning is really amazing, but what is it about these circular economy strategies that makes them successful? What's that key to success?
There's a few. I think, so yeah, there's absolutely a lot of roadmaps that are being developed these days. And I think one of the things that we've seen across most of them, and what often makes them most successful, is that they engage a really wide number of stakeholders in their development. So Brussels and Paris are both great examples of, they involved more than, I think, 100 stakeholders just in developing and writing that route map. So whether that's through interviews or workshops, they engage with sectors and businesses to understand what circular economy activity is going on in our city or country, and how can we help support that activity? What else should we be doing as a government? So I think co-developing a roadmap or strategy with stakeholders is really important. I think the use of data and making use of things like urban metabolism analysis and material flow analysis is really important as well. Like if you can understand what materials are coming into your economy and going out of them, and what you should be doing with them. I think that's really critical. So those are two things I would say sort of make roadmaps a success. But ideally, they should also be, it's very rare to see a city or country where a circular economy roadmap is just sitting by itself on a shelf. They're often integrated in other strategies. So London is a good example. They have a route map that's focused on circular economy, but they've also integrated it into their infrastructure plan and their economic development plan. And cities like Rome are including it in their resilience strategies. Toronto has it in their sort of procurement plan. And the government of Chile is looking at how they can integrate it into their climate action plan as well. So there's a lot of integration, I think, which is quite critical. It can't just sit by the side on its own.
There's been some questions in the chat, I don't know if you've been following it, but talking about things like, have they developed their strategies with the help of industry? So there's some really great questions there around collaboration. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you, you mentioned it in your introduction, is really liking local government. And as you know, I worked in local government, particularly in the UK, for a number of years before I joined the foundation. And I have to say, in my experience in local government, I don't think circular economy was part of the conversation. So I guess my question for you is, what role does local government have in taking what is a national strategy or a much wider city policy? And how does local government help with the transition to a circular economy?
Yeah, I think here the key is that local government can do a lot in that engagement circle that was in the middle of the diagram. So
yeah.
If you think about it, all of us, the closest politicians or the closest governments that we know of are like us, local councillors or the head of our borough. Those are the people and kind of services that we interact with on a more daily basis. And so they can do a lot to actually say, hey, we have this one borough in London. Let's bring our community together, or let's bring our stakeholders together and really develop a circular economy project in this context. There's a lot more kind of people-to-people interaction at the local government level. And so I think that engagement category, whether that's running workshops on and teaching small businesses what the circular economy is, or whether it's raising awareness through communications campaigns, or whether it's kind of coming up with more local specific ideas around circular economy, all of that happens at the local level.
So just sticking on the topic of engagement for a minute, that feels like one of the kind of underestimated aspects of governments of all kinds and levels, is this ability to drive that sort of second tier down in your diagram of engagement with a variety of stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of great examples of how governments, city governments, for example, are using that sort of more soft engagement strategy to actually implement circular economy or get it going in their cities. I think London is one I mentioned before, but they have a great program where they're training small businesses in their city to understand what circular economy is. And if there's an interesting startup that's working on circular economy, they're actually bringing them in and sort of providing them with small business support and so on. So it's really exciting to see governments use these kind of softer tools to encourage circular economy.
I mean, I'm a bit like you. I think I'm a bit of a policy and government nerd, and I find all of this stuff absolutely fascinating, and something that we at the foundation kind of experience as well, the need to help people understand what the circular economy is and engage in different ways, how people can action it, and how important it is to bring people together to collaborate. I mean, one of the things that I read when I was preparing for this webinar is really about procurement spend. And I think I'd like to ask you a couple of questions about that. So procurement spend between 12 and 30% of GDP in OECD countries, and that 63% of spend is subnational. I mean, that's a lot of cash that, you know, these governments and institutions have got to spend, very much like a large business. How can these governments and city governments use their buying power to accelerate the transition to a circular economy?
I think, procurement is one of the first things that come up when we're talking to governments about circular economy. They know that they have massive buying power. They know that they can influence what they buy. And they often use it as a tool to like drive innovation and to kind of encourage circular economy in their cities. So examples are, I mentioned Toronto, they've developed a specific procurement policy on that integrates circular economy in it. So they, whether they're looking at kind of the clothing and uniforms that the city is buying, or whether it's the buildings that their municipal staff are working in, or whether it's bridges and roads, they want to integrate the idea of circular economy into all of their procurement policies and what they're buying. Another, I think Seb can chime in on this because he's actually been there, but another one of my favorite examples is the city of Venlo, and how they, in their new city hall, they knew that they had to build a new city hall building, and so they decided to make sure that as much of it was adopting circular principles as possible. So they came up with this various sort of ways to do that, whether that's the building materials that went into that actual building and understanding it through a digital materials passport, or whether it was the furniture that went into the building. All of that was on a lease basis. Whether it's the building's green facade that actually kind of improves the air quality outside. So they really kind of, in all elements of that city hall building, they knew that they could use that as a bit of an experiment, as a bit of a lab to see what circular economy means in a building. So I think those are some great examples of how procurement is really a driver for innovation, and you've got to use that amazing buying power to encourage good stuff.
And Venlo, it's that you physically feel that air, the nature of the air kind of being purified around that building. If anyone hasn't been there, you really, if you stand in its radius, you generally can feel that active improvement of the environment around it, which is, you know, a sensational achievement, and shows the ability to be able to design with circular economy principles from the start, I guess. We had a question in the chat from Saskia, which is about, she asked, is procurement not one of the levers, or is that part of a part of economic incentives? So I guess she's referring back to our diagram, which I shall re-reveal. Wait for it. Just working out the sharing feature. We've only done like 20 of these now, so I'm going to be an expert. So I guess Saskia's question kind of is, where does procurement sit on our map of activities? And yeah, I mean, we actually have a more detailed version of this on the next slide if we're ready for that.
I think we are. So.
Actually put transition there. So this kind of breaks down these 5 levers a little bit for our participants.
So here, if you look at the dark green column in the middle on urban management, that's sort of where we have placed public procurement, because it is about using sort of looking at the existing assets of a city, looking at the existing products that they purchase and so on, and how can they use those powers to influence circular economy. In economic incentives, we've put things like financial support and fiscal measures. So what I mean by that, financial support is that example of supporting circular SMEs and investing in them in some way. Fiscal measures are more things around taxes and penalties and charges. So for us, procurement fits more in that kind of urban management or asset management category of policy levers.
What, I mean, do you have any good examples of something on the economic incentive side in action? Yeah.
So one of our favorite examples at the national level is actually a fiscal measure that the Swedish government brought in. This was back in 2016, so I'm actually curious about how it's progressed since then. But they decided that, so when you get your bike repaired or get your clothes repaired in some way, you still have to pay like a tax on that transaction, and that's usually VAT. But what they decided was to actually reduce the amount of tax that you paid on any repairing activity. So that essentially makes it a bit cheaper for you as a customer to repair your bike or repair your shoes. And so it's a really small kind of nudge and a sort of fiscal measure they've put in place. And the whole idea is to encourage more repair activity in the country. And it sounds like some other countries also have that sort of measure in place. And then I think we're all quite familiar with sort of bag taxes or fees on plastic bags. That in DC, for example, in the US, they've put a 5-cent plastic bag fee that's gone into effect this year. And it's actually expected to lead to a 60% reduction in plastic bags. So there's a lot of these little sort of nudges and fiscal measures that governments can use in order to either stop linear behavior or encourage circular behavior.
And we talked about this quite a bit last week with, or like in a sort of macro way with Ken Webster, this notion actually all these little things we're talking about, like what we tax or where we tax things or the different policies that are in place, they're all geared to try and make they're all rules that help whatever you want to happen more smoothly. And a lot of these things have been geared kind of for a throughput system. How do we get from a raw material to a product almost as quickly and efficiently as possible, because the model depends on that mechanism working for the economy. And so it sounds like, the Repair Act's a good example of what levers can you nudge at to what rules can you put in place that stimulate innovation to happen in a slightly different way?
Yep, exactly.
I mean, just picking up from that, Seb, we can't talk about policy and not lead into that question around legislation and regulation, can we?
Managed to do half an hour without really talking much about legislation.
And I think it's really lovely that we have, because actually I think so many times people think of governments and cities and institutions really being just there around the regulation and legislation. And I think, Ash, what you've really described to us today is that there's a myriad of different ways in which these institutions can support the transition. But we do have to talk about legislation and regulation, because again, it is a key part of what cities and governments do. But perhaps it would be useful if you could describe to us the difference between legislation and regulation, and then also how both legislation and regulation are able to enable the transition to a circular economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So legislation is, in summary, I would say legislation is kind of a destination, and regulation is actually how we get to that destination. So legislation is usually kind of a broader package of ideas. It's an act that's passed by Parliament. It sets out sort of the broad policy principles, and then regulations are more around, like, more specific policy packages around rules and codes and how are you going to achieve this broader legislative package. So they're really kind of the specifics around it. So legislation is the destination, regulation is kind of how we actually get there.
That's really useful, thanks. I'm just going to follow up with a quick question that somebody has actually asked in the audience, and really about timescales to implement policies and route maps, because we've talked a lot about these levers, but I think, again, lots of people think, oh, it'll take forever to implement this. And there was a question from Miran Leon, that I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, asking how long does it take to implement one of these policies or route maps, and shouldn't something be more specific? And maybe you can talk us through some examples of how long some of these things have taken to implement.
Yeah, it really depends on the context, which is kind of an annoying answer. But I mean, I've seen roadmaps and strategies be published within 6 to 8 months. I've seen some that have taken up to 2 years to conduct. Some of it depends on how much political support there is behind a strategy. If there's a lot, then it can get done very quickly. If some of it also depends on how they decide to develop a roadmap. So again, if you're involving hundreds or even thousands of stakeholders, that's going to take some time. The European Commission Circular Economy Action Plan is a great example of a sort of roadmap or a strategy for all of the European Union that it sort of evolved over the sort of 2012 to 2015 when it was finally released, but then had a very specific circular economy action plan, which was then implemented very quickly. So it really depends on the context as to how long these things take. But governments and cities are very used to that, and they know that there's this longer term strategy and action plan that we need to put in place, but probably at the same time, there's sort of that low hanging fruit that we can get going on that we know is pretty obvious, or we can encourage our local communities to work on circular economy projects while the strategy is still being developed. So they usually try and have this kind of overarching strategy that's being developed, but then also little mini projects that are still moving things forward without having that broader roadmap in place.
Right. So what we like to do with our From Linda Circular program in general is we like to develop something that really works very definitely, and then we like to try and mix it up and see if we can break it. So at some point in this session, we're going to try something like that, and we're going to invite a couple of you to actually ask your questions on the mic, so Ashima can hear them firsthand rather than hearing them through Rania and I's voices. So if you get a chat message or a message just saying, are you happy to switch your microphone on at some point, that's what that's about. In the meantime, Ash, I saw there were a few questions earlier on when we were talking about our kind of relationships with organizations, and there are a couple of different questions. One was sort of about, do we kind of reach out to organizations / do they, are there a lot of demand from us? So kind of like and maybe a more general question, like how do we generally work with, say, a city, the city of Toronto?
Yeah.
What does that relationship look like?
So when I first started in this governments and cities role specifically 3 years ago, it was a lot of like us reaching out to people, going out to conferences, trying to get people interested in the topic of circular economy. Fast forward to 2020, and where we almost have more interest than we can handle in a way from policymakers, which is really encouraging. So it's coming from all over the world. It's not just Europe, which is great. It is coming from all different levels of government as well, which is great. So there's a lot of interest coming in. So at this stage, we can be a bit more selective about who we work with and why, and where they are and so on, which is fantastic. And then in terms of how, like practically how we work with, I'll kind of use two examples. One is the City of Toronto, and then one is the Government of France. So with Toronto, they are a part of our network, and they do sort of come to various workshops that we run with the whole network of businesses, governments, and universities. They pitch some ideas around projects on procurement that they were working on, and so they get that benefit of being part of a circular economy network. We plan events with them. We are sort of partners in a way on like brainstorming what they would like to be working on in terms of circular economy. We make introductions for them to other cities that are working on the topic. So a lot of it is that kind of sharing best practices with them, connecting them to others that are working on the topic. And then with the French government, for example, we've been involved with the development of their national roadmap, so both informally and formally, and sort of offering advice and sitting on an advisory board in order to engage with that, the development of that roadmap. So it is a bit of a mix, and it depends on which government we're working with in terms of what we do with them.
I'd like to jump in there with a question from Marsha, again, hope I'm pronouncing that properly, and linking in towards that. So the question is, how are policies customized towards bigger companies and also SMEs in a city and a way that the city supports them? So you've been talking about how EMF has worked across a range of different organizations, businesses, governments and cities, etc. Are you seeing differences, and how are policies customized towards those large companies versus the smaller ones, and what are cities doing to support them?
So I think when it comes to small companies, typically the support that they provide is around capacity development. So I'm a small grocer in this neighborhood. I need to understand what this thing about circular economy is and why I now suddenly can't use foam packaging anymore. And so some of it is about capacity building and educating, better understanding what policy is. When it comes to kind of startups and innovators, city governments are often helping support them and connect them to businesses and help kind of encourage their new business model in a way. When it comes to larger corporations, it's actually quite interesting because typically like an IKEA or a Unilever, they're working across a number of different countries and locations, and they're not necessarily focused on a specific place. So they'll often work with them on broader policy advocacy issues. So how the European Commission, for example, takes input from these more international companies on like what are some of the legislative barriers you're facing, or how can policy support the work that you're doing across Europe and so on. So yeah, definitely there's nuances between how they work with large companies and small ones. Right,
here we go. We're going to try this. Manasai, I'm probably not saying the name right. I apologize. Manasai, please tell me how to say it properly so that if we do this again, we get it right. You had a great question, I think, about the criteria for a circular city.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Sure. So my name's Mansi, and yeah, I wanted to know if there are certain like fixed criteria or parameters that, like if you're talking about in terms of cities, that cities have to meet to be declared circular, and are these different for different cities? Like assuming, you know, different cities have like different challenges. So I'm just, yeah, that's my question.
Great, thanks. Nice to meet you. So this is kind of, to me, linked to how do you measure a circular economy in cities, or like how do you define a circular economy in cities? And in short, the answer is that there's no like one definition out there or like a specific set of criteria for whether you're declared a circular city or not. I think there's certainly things around there's some existing indicators like the percentage of material going to landfill, or recycling rates, or the volume of like repair and reuse and sharing activity in the city. So those are some indicators that are used to kind of measure and declare whether there's circular economy activity going on in the city. But it's something that a lot of organizations are working on right now to actually figure out how do I know that as a city I'm moving from a beginning level circular city to a more advanced level. So we're thinking about it a little bit. We're talking to the OECD about some of the work they're doing. There's a lot of measurement going on. We ourselves are doing it in terms of how do you measure a business that's circular, and maybe there's some interesting data you can use and say, okay, there's this many circular businesses in the city, and therefore this city is now more circular than it was before. So it's being explored at the moment, I would say.
Thank you.
I hope that, yeah.
Thanks. Seb, are you going to brave inviting another poor soul to ask their question?
Our next guest is Kelly, who had a question about... Well, Kelly, why don't you just tell us what your question was actually, since I can't find it.
Question. Thanks, guys. It's really lovely listening to you. My question is, do you have any examples of circular economy initiatives that have been implemented at the city level that are inclusive and have actually helped to integrate communities where high levels of inequality exist? I'm from South Africa.
So am I, and I recognize your accent. Lovely to have you here.
I feel like this question has almost been planted, because I do have a really great example, and it's one of my favorites. But so this is an example from Belo Horizonte in Brazil. It is one of the largest cities in Brazil, and has like many cities in the developing economy and developed economy, there's a bit of an e-waste problem. And so the city government knew that they had all these computers and phones and keyboards and everything basically being sent to landfill. They knew they were high value items. They also knew they had a digital inclusion issue where a lot of public libraries and a lot of schools didn't have access to computers. And here there were all these computers being thrown to landfill. So they decided, with the help of the national government as well, to implement and develop these kind of computer reconditioning centers. So they started with a few in the city, and the computer reconditioning centers were essentially where the city would collect these computers that were otherwise going to landfill. And they hired specifically youth that were at risk or unemployed, and usually coming from sort of backgrounds where they needed more skills and training. And so they hired them to work on this sort of, in this computer reconditioning center to acquire a new skill. Those computers were then diverted from landfill. They were sort of refurbished and sent to local libraries and schools where they helped with digital inclusion issues. And I think it's a great example because it shows how the city government is not only keeping sort of products and materials in use for longer, but also training young and vulnerable people and making sure that sort of public libraries and those in low income groups get access to computers and technology that they need. And it was so successful that it's now being replicated in other cities in Brazil. So I think it really is, it's a great one for showing how the idea of a circular economy and capturing value also can contribute to social equity and inclusion goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Great question, and thanks for that great response, Ash. We are hopefully going to have Madeline unmuting and asking her great question, which is all about knowledge sharing and open source design. Madeline, are you ready to ask your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yes, welcome.
Okay, great. Thanks for choosing my question. I asked, so do you agree that a culture of open source design and knowledge sharing is key to designing circular cities? And if so, how can policy help us to break down some of the hurdles that might be preventing this at the moment?
Ooh, good question. Yes, I definitely agree that open source design is very important. It is also a big part of this kind of local manufacturing and open source manufacturing movement that's emerging in a lot of cities across the world. I definitely see that as part of this sort of vision for a circular city is kind of how can you encourage distributed manufacturing and encourage local manufacturers to be producing products that might be designed at a global level. So there's some interesting business examples of this. Open Desk is one of them. I think we have a case study on it somewhere, but they're basically, it's a platform where you can upload designs for furniture and desks and various other things. And then local manufacturers can then actually sort of use 3D printing and so on to develop them locally. And you then avoid kind of a table being shipped from New York to London or from sort of Asia into various cities across the world. So that sort of certainly plays into the circular economy vision on the whole. In terms of how policy, so the question was around how policy can help enable that sort of activity?
Yeah, I think, I guess like there's a lot of like competition is something that's, you know, happens in every industry. Yeah. And I guess knowledge sharing is kind of the opposite of competition. So I guess would policy play a part in making something like that happen?
Definitely. And I think that that's exactly where kind of this policymakers can play a role in convening, and that, again, going back to that little engagement circle in the middle of the diagram, they have a strong role to play in pre-competitive innovation and encouraging the sort of stopping innovation becoming this very I don't necessarily want to say this, but like competitive space where it's like, this is my idea and my design, and therefore my company is the only one that's going to produce this. And so, yeah, I would definitely say that there's a strong role, again, for local government to play in encouraging those sort of convenings and knowledge sharing.
Okay,
Awesome,
so
thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeline. I'm very pleased with how this has gone. We have one more on microphone question for you, Ashma, before you're almost off the hook from your interrogation. This one's from Josephine. Again, so sorry if I'm saying that wrong. And you have a question about imports and exports and what that means in a circular city for circular economy. So take the mic.
Will do. Thank you, Seb. Yes, so to me, this question of what really makes a circular city is very interesting, because I very much see a city as a kind of nexus of flows of materials and products in many ways. And to me, it's kind of interesting to think about, okay, we're importing perhaps all of these materials and goods into a city. At what scale do we want to close the loop? Do we want to close the loop on the scale of the entire world, or do we want to do it at kind of national level, at the city level? And how does that work in terms of trade generally? It would be really interesting to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not quite an expert on the trade policy yet, but we do have a great report that I know the IEEP produced, which I think my colleague Helena can link to, that will tell you more about that. But I'll definitely touch on sort of your question around scales, which is really interesting to me, because I largely work with city governments, and they're often actually hitting this a little bit of a bubble of like, what can we do within our city, and what should we not be doing, and what should we be doing with our region. And I think that really depends on the material or the product that you're looking at. So some things like sharing drills and the sharing economy work really well at that neighborhood level or at the city level. When it comes to food, you can't close loops of food in an urban context. You need rural and you need peri-urban. And so all of that needs to happen at a more regional level. When it comes to things like, manufacturing and other like more technical products, again, you can't solve everything within your own city or within your own neighborhood and close all those loops at that scale. So you need to explore what's the most appropriate scale to loop those things. And by no means are we suggesting that like all circular economy will happen at that local level. Some global loops or some regional loops will still need to exist. So I think everyone's very much at that exploration level of like what is most appropriate right now.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you very much, Josephine, for that question. This week, every week, Ash, we set this group of people a sort of homework or stimulus, and they eagerly respond to it. And the responses this week have been no less impressive than any other week. We're really specifically asking them about misconceptions, and there's an article that Ken Webster wrote and a video that's associated to it. They've been responding to, and they've been looking at things like and talking about things like the circular economy isn't just really about recycling on steroids, and the circular economy isn't only about reducing negative impacts and making things more efficient. It's about doing something fundamentally different. My question to you is, do those same misconceptions kind of crop up in your conversations at a kind of policy level? Because a lot of those are kind of framed a little bit through like a business lens of, well, are you just going to recycle more of your product, or are you going to design things fundamentally differently? How does that kind of level, how does that play out at the level of policy?
Yeah, so I think the common misconceptions when it comes to policy and circular economy is, firstly, when we're working with city governments, they think it's all about waste management and recycling and it's end of pipe. And that's partly because that's what they think they have influence over. And so they, local governments often will be like, okay, yeah, we have a recycling infrastructure in place and that's all that we can do. When actually, as we've shown, they have a lot more influence on how products can be designed and how things are used in their city than they think they do. So that's definitely one misconception that we deal with all the time. And it's kind of getting them to believe that they can do more with the circular economy than just put the bins out, essentially. And then at the sort of broader national policy level, I think some of again, there's a lot of just misconceptions about who should be playing what role in government and what the national government should be doing versus the local government. So that's been kind of interesting to play with as well.
Thank you, Ash. That's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is it's always good to take away some things. And I feel like today I've come away with a lot more than I went into, which has been really, really interesting. And some of the key things for me that I'm going to take away from today is definitely that message that one size doesn't fit all, not only in what you said, Ash, but some of the conversations and the questions that we've had, you know, sort of how far and how wide do policies stretch? Are they local? Are they national? And it really, for me, feels like there is a real flavor of a little bit of everything, and we will get closer to that circular economy transition that we're looking for. So certainly that one size doesn't fit all approach. The other thing that I think is really key to take away for me, and I mean, I've worked in local government, as I said, so I'm aware of this, and you've just touched on it, but that idea that policy is more than just legislation and regulation, that actually we need to get cities and governments to understand the full suite of tools and levers that they have within their power, some of which don't necessarily seem as obvious as the waste and recycling or the setting the tax and things like that. So, you know, think about how they use their public procurement and how they engage with people, etc. And I suppose my last takeaway, and it links back to that engagement piece, is how important collaboration and engagement is in taking forward and implementing the policies and strategies that come out of whatever level of government. I think we've seen that not only in the examples that you've given, but some of the chat that's been in the chat box, that really this is about bringing together players at multiple levels and engaging people at local level. And there've been lots of questions around how can I do this in my local economy? You know, engage your local politicians, and for the politics to engage wider than just the policymakers that they sit in their county halls with. So I think for me, those are the three big takeaways, and I hope everybody else has had as much out of the session as I have. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rhaenyra. Thank you, Ash. I'm not a policy nerd myself, but I still enjoyed this. Before we let you all go, a couple of my favorite part of this whole thing is the admin. So let's just talk through a couple of things quickly. So the recording for the plastic session, which you wisely chose not to attend, is under the hashtag recorded sessions on the Slack channel. A quick reminder of the Slack channel link in case anyone's not on there. Do make sure you get on there. It's a super cool space. What we want you to do this week is to get back together in your trios. We will post this in the Slack channel, but to share up to 500 words. It doesn't have to be 500 words, can be a few bullet points. To share some reflections on this session and especially with people who attended other sessions. And then to post some of those sort of joined up reflections after you've had your conversations in your trios, or even before, in the week 5 Slack channels. A quick reminder of the Slack links, and also a quick reminder of the fact that week 6 is another double week. I won't tell you the right choice yet, but they are, once again, actually these times and dates are wrong, so ignore those completely. I'm going to stop sharing screen. Anna will share the correct times and dates and links in the Slack channel, but they will be at the regular time, 3 to 4 p.m. BST on a Tuesday. And you once again have to make a choice, and there is once again a right answer. So I will leave you to work that out and find out whether you got it right or not next week. The other thing you might find interesting is that on Tuesday lunchtimes, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is doing a Circular Economy weekly show. We've shared that link in the Slack channels as well. Next week's show is focused on the ramifications for circular economy from COVID-19. And we're joined by Joss Blériot from the foundation, who's authored an article on that topic. In many of these sessions, we've had questions about COVID-19 and what it means for circular economy. So good place to tune in and get our latest perspective on that. But other than that, until next time, we will post the recording, we will share the slides, and we will share details about next week's sessions all in Slack. So thank you so much for being such active participants today, and we'll see you next week.